So I'd like to welcome you all to the UC Davis Forum. Good afternoon, I'm Mary Krogan. I'm the Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second event in the 2020-2021 season of the UC Davis Forums and the Public University and the Social Good. Today's event is only the second wholly virtual forum we've had in this series. While we are grateful to have this safe option for our forums, we do look forward to resuming on-campus events in tandem with live streaming in 2021. The UC Davis Forums was established in 2012. Each academic year, it presents about a half dozen lectures by experts from a range of disciplines. The series is unique in its purpose. It seeks to promote informed and thoughtful dialogue among members of the campus community and the public on the following subjects: the major challenges facing the public university, ways of responding to these challenges, and how the public university is evolving. With an ultimate goal of helping to produce a public university that will best serve society and individuals, this series poses the following question: what should and can the public university be in the 21st century? In our preceding 8 seasons, the UC Davis Forums has presented distinguished speakers on a wide range of topics pertaining to the public university and the social good. These have included educational access and affordability, sexism and racism in the academy, and the relationship between academic mission and neoliberal metrics of success, among many other topics. We are currently finalizing arrangements for forums to be held this winter and spring quarters. Look for upcoming information on these, along with descriptions and videos of past events on the series website, which is forums.ucdavis.edu. This afternoon, we are delighted to welcome Kieran Flaherty, also known as Kiki, who serves as Associate Vice President and Director of UC State Governmental Relations in the UC Office of the President. The title of his talk is UC Challenges and Opportunities: Navigating California's Current and Future Political Landscape. I do not have advanced knowledge of what Mr. Flaherty will say, but I am encouraged by the optimism of his talk title. The term political landscape sounds relatively serene and even picturesque. He might, for example, have made reference to a labyrinth, a tar pit, or even that cornfield that Stephen King wrote about. Even more reassuring, he seems to believe that we can successfully navigate our political landscape and find new opportunities there. I know that I speak for everyone in saying that we are very much looking forward to hearing his ideas. But before Mr. Flaherty is formally introduced, I want to thank all who have made this event possible. The UC Davis Forum Steering Committee, led by Martin Kenny, Professor of Community and Regional Development in Human Ecology. The Department of Human Ecology for joining the Office of the Provost in sponsoring this event. And all of you in our audience for making time in your busy schedule to participate today via Zoom. And with greatest appreciation, Mr. Flaherty, for sharing your knowledge and insights and what I know will be an enlightening and pertinent talk. Now it is my distinct pleasure to yield the podium to former UC Davis Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor, Ralph Hexter, who will introduce Mr. Flaherty. Ralph provided extraordinary service as Provost and EVC from 2011 through June of this year, with a notable hiatus when he was called away for other duties. Those other duties from April 2016 through July 2017 were to serve as acting chancellor and then interim chancellor of UC Davis. During all of these years, both as provost and as chancellor, he was also distinguished professor of classics and comparative literature, a position he continues to hold today. Before coming to Davis, Ralph was president of Hampshire College in Massachusetts, and before that, executive dean of the College of Letters and Science at UC Berkeley. Early in his tenure as provost here at Davis, he founded the UC Davis Forums. We are fortunate that he continues to contribute to the series as a member of our steering committee. Welcome, Ralph. Glad to have you both here.
Thank you so much, Provost Krogan, two of my favorite words in the English language. It's really a pleasure and honor to welcome one of our UC colleagues as the speaker for today's forum. Based in Sacramento, Mr. Flaherty serves the entire UC system as Associate Vice President and Director of UC State Governmental Relations. Previously, he served as Deputy to UC Chief Financial Officer, Nathan Brostrom, managing UC's budget-related matters with the state of California, including critical interactions with legislators, key budget and policy staff, and the California State Department of Finance. Before that, he worked for 6 years in government relations at UC Berkeley, and prior to that, 8 years in a similar capacity at UCSF. Clearly, he has deep roots and long experience in the University of California. All of us in education want to know how one prepares for such a career. Well, Mr. Flaherty received his BA from another public research university, the University of Minnesota. He majored in international relations, and indeed, not only does he speak Spanish, but he lived in Spain for a time. Once in the Bay Area, he earned his JD from Golden Gate University while interning at the San Francisco Public Defender's Office and at an eviction defense office in the Tenderloin. Before joining UC, he worked with SF public officials, both the San Francisco City Attorney Louis Rennie and then San Francisco Supervisor Mark Leno. More importantly, Kieran, or Kiki, lived in Davis for 5 years while he was working in Woodland with then Congressman Vic Fazio, and later as an attorney at the Small Business Administration in Sacramento. These are only the highlights, but I will conclude with a little-known fact. This true son of Minnesota's first love is ice hockey, and he plays on not one, but 2 Bay Area teams. He's number 7 on the SF Earthquakes, a co-ed, LGBT-friendly and inclusive hockey team that has competed in tournaments from Australia to Germany and LA to Toronto. He can share with us whether that kind of scrappy, on-the-ice brawling of professionals with our state government in Sacramento. We look forward to your talk, Kiki.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everyone. I certainly would like to thank Provost Krogan and the steering committee for the UC Davis Forums, including Professor Kenny and most of all, Professor and Provost Emeritus Ralph Hexter, for honoring me by asking me to present to you today, and such a warm introduction. And I do think I'll have some insights on how hockey has helped me over the years in Sacramento. I will be honest, however, today's topic is daunting. Navigating politics is always challenging. As if to underscore the point, I am not only speaking to you over Zoom because of the pandemic, but this is now how the university conducts its meetings in what is often the very personal, social, relationship-based world of state politics. It's hard to make a point, gather the intel, or cut a deal when Zoom tells you that your internet is unstable. Yet with UC hospitals and scientists tirelessly engaged in pandemic-related patient care and research, also with our country and our state being less than 2 weeks after a consequential election, you may have heard about that, and with the ramifications of wildfires still looming large, there is of course an uncertain economic future. A discussion of the challenges and opportunities, I hope, will be anything but boring. So stay with me. I'm going to try and make this entertaining despite working over Zoom. I have already shared my screen with you now. That means you should be able to see both my PowerPoint slides and also a little window of the presenters. So I'm going to start today with one of my very favorite quotations of all time. This is one that looms large in the annals of sayings that political animals everywhere are familiar with. It's particularly apropos one day after the Veterans Day holiday. So I'm going to take you back to the vice presidential debates of 1992. Rear Admiral James Bond Stockdale, that's his real name, James Bond Stockdale, the running mate of third-party candidate Ross Perot. He was sharing the stage with Vice President Dan Quayle, then Vice President Dan Quayle, and then Senator Al Gore. And when he was asked to introduce himself and make his opening statement, he said, "Who am I? Why am I here?" For me, you could be asking the same question. And so I'm going to answer that question in the negative by saying I'm not an academic, I'm not a researcher, and so many of the UC Davis Forum speakers have been. I'm much more of a practitioner of policy and advocacy on behalf of the university. And although I am a lawyer, I am definitely not a political scientist or working for UC's general counsel. So what I hope I can provide today are some practical, relatable insights into the relationship of UC and the state and how UC can navigate the politics, not only to advance our instruction, research, and public service mission, but also to help ensure that the state is going to continue to lead and succeed. So I'm going to move now to the first slide. And we'll discuss today's topics. So the flow of my talk is going to borrow from the university's mission of instruction, research, and public service. First, understanding California's current political landscape, absolutely essential to formulating a political path to success. California government is unique. It's unique from other states. It's unique from the federal government. So too is the university's governance structure. So in the spirit of instruction, I'm going to provide a bit of California Government 101 and how UC fits into it. I'm going to talk a little bit about UC's governance and funding, as well as the state's governance and funding and how the two differ. So for purposes of describing this in a real simple, easy to remember way, I'll talk about the 3 M's, money, measures, and the majority. And yes, of course, we're going to focus on the 2020 election. Obsessing over it last week was just not enough. I'm sure we all need to get back to it by now. And we're going to try and translate what some of those answers mean specifically for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and perhaps for research and state support at UC. Of course, we're going to discuss the impacts of COVID-19. Finally, I'm going to address what does the Sacramento want and what do they expect from UC? So that is our understanding of California's current political landscape. In the second bullet, you're going to see that we're going to survey the future political landscape. Here we're divided into invoking a bit of UC's research character. We're going to look at some of the data, review a little bit of the trends, and even examine some history, see how we can predict the future. We're going to start next then with a very provocative question: is California in crisis? Is the university in crisis? And we'll do that by looking at the challenges that we face and the opportunities we will have to shape our future state. So let's face it, challenges is just a very polite euphemism for problems. We've got big problems, although some of them are quite obvious. There's some that might be surprising to you. So we're going to look at the opportunities, which are, of course, just solutions as a corollary to those problems. And I think you might find some of those surprising as well. So after understanding the current political landscape and surveying the future political landscape, we're ready to navigate a political path to success. Thirdly, and finally, that's where we're going to spend a lot of our time. I'm going to offer this political path to success, and I'm going to borrow from the UC's public service mission, and that's where that comes into play. So I'm going to make the best case that the best political path forward is for UC and the state to align, but align very strategically. At the same time, there needs to be a trueness to ourselves, to each of ourselves, to excel really in our respective roles. And then finally, I've got some ideas, among other things, that we can consider as the best political path forward. After that, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't have a call to action for you. And then we'll close out with some questions and answer and hopefully some discussion. So as I mentioned, I am not a political scientist. There are many experts, hopefully many of them who are listening, I hope to provide a practical perspective, maybe some insights. It may seem a bit vague and rudimentary for those of you that are quite familiar already with the university and its relationship with the state, but you can certainly share with me during question and answer, and we can delve more deeply. So now I'm going to move on to the next slide. Great. Understanding California's current political landscape. So as I mentioned, to understand California's current political landscape, we need to understand some basics of California government, and these tie into what I'm going to cover later on in the conversation. We also would do well to understand how you...
Forgive my interruption, but the slides are not advancing.
I'm sorry, Ralph. Today's topics, here we are, understanding California's political landscape. Did that advance?
Somehow we're not seeing that. We just see the title slide and the presentation mode. Maybe forgive the, this is an improvement.
That is good. So thank you for pointing that out, Ralph. This is the hazard of Zoom, of course. I had my screen share paused. So I'll be sure and unpause myself when I advance the next time. So
great, thanks.
Understanding California's political landscape. So we're going to address this in the spirit of UC's instructional mission. I'm going to give a little California 101 course from the perspective of someone who works at the intersection of UC and the state. I can boil it down basically to three things. I call them the 3 M's: money, measures, and majority. Starting with money, I'm speaking about here is how the state raises its general fund money, how it's compelled to expend that money, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the same for UC, how we get our revenue and how we spend it. Both the state and UC are currently heavily impacted by the pandemic in this regard, which really catalyzed our current economic downturn. So starting with the state, California raises its general funds through personal income tax, sales tax, and corporate tax. What's really important to know about that is the balance among those revenue sources. Currently, the personal income tax, which is notoriously volatile, comprises the largest share of revenue, followed distantly by the sales and use tax, and a very small share is the corporate tax. So that is 72% of state revenue coming from personal income tax. 50 years ago, that was about 35%, or half. Currently, the sales tax accounts for about 20%. 50 years ago, sales tax was the lion's share. It was more than 50%. You can see that they've flipped. The personal income tax base does include revenues that are generated from capital gains. So these are gains on sales of stock, bonds, certain types of real property, certain other assets. That's part of the reason why it's notoriously volatile. What that means now is when the economy goes into recession, California's personal income tax revenues drop, sometimes precipitously and sometimes with a lag. This creates stress on government-funded functions. In short, for UC and other state general fund stakeholders, there's going to be less funding available from the state general fund, and we see cuts. Additionally, coronavirus. The state entered 2020 with $5.6 billion surplus and a very hefty reserve. By May, the state was facing a $54 billion budget gap for the next year, for 2021. Why? Because nearly 20% of Californians who were employed in February were out of work in May. There were huge additional costs to California associated with the pandemic as well. But the state did a really good job. They utilized a substantial rainy day reserve of about $9 billion. They canceled plans for expanding programs. They did some internal borrowing. And certainly they relied on about $10 billion in federal funding that had been approved for coronavirus relief. That came to the state mostly through medical programs and the like, some child care. We're going to talk a little bit more on coronavirus later. But I also want to touch on one other important thing to note, and it's something that almost all Californians know about. Like many other states, California has restrictions on how local government can raise funds through property tax, what we commonly know as Prop 13 in the state constitution. It basically says property tax is not determined by fair market value assessments alone in any given year, but rather is recalculated at a time of sale of real property. So this has created a huge shift in the past in the way that K through 12 schools are funded. So purposes of our conversation, these are two very important elements of how the state raises money through its personal income tax. And then there is this issue of Prop 13, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So California, now shifting over to how it spends the money that we get, is compelled by the state constitution to spend a set amount of its general fund budget for certain priorities. The best known and largest example is Prop 98. So it was passed in 1988, and it guarantees the state must spend a minimum amount of its general fund on K through 12. So it's a measure that intends to address the changes in property tax revenue received by K through 12 as a result of Proposition 13. The state also must expend for healthcare programs because a failure to do so would make California ineligible for large amounts of very much needed federal funding. So it's like the state needs to put up dollars in order to draw down federal dollars. Medi-Cal, for instance. What this means for UC is that we're funded through a portion of the state budget that is considered discretionary. And legislators and the governors are truly quite limited in how much discretion they have over the discretionary budget. The discretionary budget includes things like the judiciary, but it also includes UC and California State University and the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. So I do recall explaining this to a young student once who I was speaking with about the discretionary budget, and she pondered it and said, discretionary funding for the courts, higher ed, and prisons. It's sort of the case of Yale versus jail. So it's kind of amusing, but in reality, it's not funny because it really squeezes out public higher education in some ways. Just important for us to know, we're competing for funding in an area of the budget where state policymakers are somewhat limited. And we're also competing against other high priorities, things like housing, addressing mental health and its relationship with homelessness, and of course, things like wildfires and natural disasters. So a lot that has to be taken into consideration. It might be surprising for some of you to know when thinking about UC and how we get our money, that of UC's nearly $40 billion overall budget, only about 10% is from state general fund revenues. That's probably not as bad as it sounds. The university's budget is structured to have multiple revenue sources. We draw billions of dollars in federal research funding from agencies such as the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense, others. We also operate what we call sales and services. These are things like housing, dining, many events on campuses, things like athletics. They're set up to be self-sustaining business models. And by far the largest portion of revenue in the UC budget is the UC Academic Health Enterprise, which operates 6 health centers, often called our academic medical centers, where over $14 billion in revenues are primarily generated by reimbursement for patient care services. So when you think of that overall $40 billion, there is very, very large portion of that that is attributable to other revenue sources. So when I say that state general fund support for UC is 10% of the overall budget, you do need to look at that in context. Think of the medical centers at about 35%. Think of the sales and services about 20%, federal research somewhere in the range of 11%. Importantly, student tuition and fees about 11%, a little bit higher than state general fund support, at least last year. What is important about the 10% from the state and the 11% roughly from tuition is that these funds are fundamental to the core operations of the university. We call it our core funds budget. These are the funds that are used primarily for salaries and benefits for faculty and teachers and researchers, teaching assistants, programs that support students. They're a very significant piece of the funds to establish that foundation so that we can enact our instruction, research, and public service mission. It is how we have the facilities and the personnel to educate hundreds of thousands of students and enable us to draw down federal and state research dollars, as well as be good partners to our communities. So next, that's money. Next, we're gonna move to the next of the 3 M's. And the next one is measures. By that I mean statewide ballot measures. California has a notoriously facile way of qualifying measures for the ballot. So this can be a blessing or a curse. This is California's form of direct democracy and has led to the derogatory moniker ballot box budgeting, when the state's voters enshrine in the Constitution certain expenditures, including Proposition 98. Moreover, both the voters and the legislature can qualify measures for the ballot rather easily, including amendments to the Constitution. The voters do this through the initiative process, through signature gathering. The number of signatures from registered voters must be equal to at least 8% of the total votes cast for the office of governor at the last gubernatorial election. To make it more simple, that's roughly about 1 million registered voter signatures to qualify something for the ballot, at least currently. Now, the legislature, on the other hand, can qualify a constitutional amendment for the ballot with a 2/3 vote of both houses. They don't need the governor's signature for this. And so they can qualify a constitutional amendment to the ballot, again, with that 2/3 vote. Once on the ballot, it's only a majority vote is needed to approve it. There are many states that do it the opposite, where it's a 50% threshold for the legislature to qualify it. It may be a much higher signature gathering threshold, but then it takes a 2/3 of the vote. So California is quite unique from other places. This has recently become a major issue for UC. The legislature from time to time has attempted to qualify measures for the ballot that would impact UC's historic autonomy in the state constitution, or otherwise impact UC operations through a constitutional mandate of some sort. In general, the university is opposed to that. We can talk a little bit more about that later, but it is something that we should keep in mind that the legislature, public policy makers, even voters will often think is a good path or a good way to reform the university. So those are the first two characteristics of state government that are really germane for understanding our political relationship with the state, how we raise the money, how we spend the money, and what the impact of ballot measures are. The third M, I'm going to shorthand as majority. So we all know that California is a deep blue state, but you might not be aware of how important a majority in the legislature is. We discussed that it takes a 2/3 vote to qualify measures, but the state also requires a 2/3 vote to increase any state taxes or fees. It's made it very challenging for the state, not only to try and raise revenue, but also to get rid of any tax loopholes or tax breaks that were made in prior legislation, because those modifications to tax law would also require a 2/3 vote. In fact, California was one of 3 states in the country that used to require both a 2/3 vote, not only to raise revenue, but just to approve a spending plan, just to approve a budget. In fact, I do recall an influential state legislator who was quite exasperated. The state was unable to approve a budget, and it was a full 2 months after the deadline that's listed in the Constitution to do so. And he was complaining about how out of step California was with the rest of the country. I agreed and offered that there were only 3 states that had this requirement: California, Rhode Island, and Arkansas. And he turned to me and said sarcastically, "Of course we in California would follow the lead of those 2 states. Rhode Island has roughly the same size and population as California, and Arkansas, demographically and historically, we're almost the same place." So with that sarcasm aside, the voters solved that problem for him in 2010, availing themselves of the initiative process by passing Proposition 25, which eliminated the need to have a 2/3 vote for a budget. So at least now we can pass a spending plan on time, if not raise revenues by having less than a 2/3 vote. So that's my little civics lesson on California Government 101. Let's talk elections. That's what everybody wants to do. One major consequence of the federal elections are that California loses a United States senator in gaining a vice president. That's, of course, Kamala Harris, who is, in fact, a UC alumna, UC Hastings, if I'm correct. Amendment 17 to the U.S. Constitution allows our governor, Governor Newsom, to appoint a replacement. The replacement is going to serve either for the remainder of the term or until the next general election, whichever comes first. In this instance, they're the same date, November of 2022. So whoever is appointed will have the ability to stand for re-election in November 2022 and serve until that time. So there's another major consequence: control of the United States Senate. The state and the university were hopeful that the federal government would move swiftly to provide additional coronavirus relief funds Frankly, we were all expecting the state Senate or the United States Senate would shift over to Democratic control. It's still up in the air because of those two outstanding runoffs in the state of Georgia, both oddly in the state of Georgia. And so we don't know for sure if the United States government is going to pass a coronavirus relief package that would help the states. And what the state was looking for in particular was a package that not only helped businesses, not only helped other aspects of industry and the economy, but funding that came directly to the state so that it could reverse some of the cuts that the state had to make to balance its budget for the next current budget, or for the current budget year. So, you know, there's a lot of people that have asked, why has this happened? Why was the polling so far off in some of these races? Why were we wrong? I'm not only not a political scientist, I'm not a pollster, I'm not a political analyst, but I did hear one on the radio, and he broke it down in 3 ways. He said there's 3 things, and one of them they call the diploma divide. So it is pretty much true throughout the United States that college educated white persons are more inclined now to vote democratically, and the non-college educated whites are less likely to vote democratically and more likely to vote Republican. And so that's what they're calling the diploma divide. And what that means is they think that they were undersampling when it came to non-college educated white persons. So their sampling could have been off. And so this person was a pollster, and that's one thing they said. The other thing they said was kind of interesting. They called it the phenomenon of the shy Trump voter. So there are many persons who were saying that they were not sure who they were going to vote for, but were actually planning on voting for President Trump and just didn't want to say so at that time. And then the third thing that he pointed to was a split ballot. In a split ballot, they said in many of the races that they saw where the president was trailing congressional races. And in those congressional races, the president was polling, or actually the votes tabulated were about 2% below what the congressional candidate from his same party. So there were fewer Republicans that were voting against or voting for the president than there were that were voting for congressional candidates. And so what that means is there's some problem in the sampling, it seems, and this probably impacted the United States Senate, and therefore probably impacts what kind of relief the state is going to be able to achieve moving forward. Of course, we don't know yet, but we'll see. As for state elections, there are still nearly 1.5 million ballots to be counted. This is not unusual. It was a remarkably smooth election in California, and frankly, quite smooth throughout the entire United States, considering the circumstances and the pandemic. More pertinent to UC, the UC Regents had endorsed 2 ballot measures on the statewide ballot, Proposition 16 and Proposition 14. So Prop 16 was qualified for the ballot through that majority vote that I discussed earlier from the legislature, more than 2/3 of each houses. This is the measure that would overturn the prohibition on affirmative action that's currently in the state constitution. The prohibition on using race as a factor among other factors when considering admissions in public education is commonly known in California as Proposition 209, which passed the voters in 1996. It also has restrictions on affirmative action in public contracts and public services. Now, Prop 16 would have overturned that, and it would have allowed the university, public universities anyway, to use race as a factor in its admission process. It is trailing by a very wide margin, by 13 points, and it's not going to be successful. So it's important to note that there are only 8 states in the United States who have a similar prohibition to the one California has through Proposition 209. It's also important to note that the US Constitution, albeit allowing race to be taken into consideration as a factor in admission, also prohibits the use of quotas or set formulas with regard to race and admission. So this measure was endorsed by the regents who felt that Prop 209 had a detrimental impact on admission to UC by banning any consideration of race, ethnicity, and gender, even when it would have been just allowed to be taken into consideration as a factor among several. California, of course, as I mentioned, is one of the few states that went in this direction, and we're staying in that direction. Very big disappointment for the university. On the other hand, Proposition 14, which is bonds to continue stem cell research, was also endorsed by the Board of Regents, and it currently maintains a narrow lead of 2%. If the measure passes, it would provide $5.5 billion in new bond funding for California's Stem Cell Research Institute. That institute is known as the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, or CIRM, which was started by a vote of the voters in 2004. At that time, it had $3 billion in funding. So these new funds would be used to continue funding stem cell and other vital research related to a variety of conditions. So here's why I think this is so important. And this will make a little bit more sense when I talk about the political path forward. This is a vote for science. This is a vote for research. This is a vote by the taxpayers directly themselves to entrust institutes of higher education with huge sums of taxpayer dollars for purposes of basic scientific research and clinical research. That's huge. Moreover, this measure was qualified not through the legislature, but through the initiative process, through signature gathering. In my observation, voters routinely reject debt spending when they are experiencing their own economic uncertainty. This runs counter to that. Investing in general obligation bonds, for instance, can often fall prey to voter unease about the overall economy and then fail to be approved. UC, CSU, the community colleges, and K through 12 experienced that in the primary election earlier this year when voters rejected a $15 billion facilities construction bond. Also, when the voters are confused by ballot measures, they tend to vote no. Yet for stem cell research, they were willing to approve a $5.5 billion bond. So I think this is significant for what it signals as much as for what it does. There are obvious benefits around what it does. UC has been the recipient of hundreds of awards from CIRM since 2004, with a combined value of well in excess of $1 billion system-wide. Just a quick word now about the state elections and the state legislature. As I mentioned before, California is deep blue, with Democrats going into the elections with solid majorities in both houses. In fact, in both houses, Democrats not only had 50% majorities, they had supermajorities of over 2/3. Furthermore, the Assembly Democrats had what we jokingly call a super duper majority of 75% of the seats. Well, it appears that the Assembly will not see much change in their makeup. They'll still have approximately 60 out of 80 seats in that chamber. But in the state Senate, it appears Democrats will surpass the 29 out of 90 seats they currently hold and perhaps land on 31 or possibly even 32 seats in the state Senate. So what this means in the California legislature is the dynamic is going to be a lot less about red versus blue. It's a lot less about Republicans versus Democrats. And what we say is more about red versus green. So red represents the upper chamber of the state legislature, the Senate, and green represents the larger chamber, the state assembly. Between the houses is where this compromise and reconciliation needs to happen. So that's why we say red versus green, but ultimately they do tend to work together and move through a lot of big items, even during a pandemic. So it's hard to leave the election alone for a while and address what it is that the state's leaders and their constituents want and expect from UC, but that is what we're going to address shortly here.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
To sum it up.
It looks like the slides are not advancing.
Oh, okay, thank you again. Okay, this last point on this slide, we're going to try and address what Sacramento wants and what they're expecting from the university. So if I had to summarize it, I would say that they want in. What they want is to get admission to the University of California, and they want it to be affordable. So access and affordability. Now, the university currently enrolls in academic year 1920 an astounding 226,000 undergraduates. That's total enrollment of all undergraduates currently at the university. With regard to applications from students who want to join this robust body, in 2020, UC received a stunning amount of applications for admission, both from freshmen and students who want to transfer, well in excess of 200,000 applications. Basically, Californians know and understand the value of UC education, and they want in. And we want them here. There's another element here as well. They would like the persons who have access to our university, their university, to be reflective of the full breadth and richness of the state, all our ethnicities, everyone rural and urban, and from all backgrounds. The university is responding. Compared to the 1990s, we are now offering admission to about twice as many California high school students. That's a good thing. In fact, the university made more offers of admission than ever before for next academic year. Admissions offers to California freshmen increased by 12%. Their admissions rate is 70%. The admission rate for California community college transfer students is even higher. It remains at 76% for the second year in a row. So some legislators, and certainly their constituents, are quick to point out that when UC offers admission and guarantees admission to the top 1/8 of high school graduates in California, it's not a guarantee to a student's campus of choice. That is true. I once had a legislator who ran into me. We were at Safeway, and he mentioned that he had been approached in Safeway a little bit earlier. I think the term he used was accosted at Safeway a little bit earlier by a shopper and a constituent. And this shopper said, well, look, my father went to Cal. I went to Santa Barbara. Junior is down at Chico State University, and his sister better get into UCLA. That's all I've got to say. Now, that's just one way of looking at the excellent and high demand that, the excellent regard and the high demand that there is for the University of California. But as I said, the university is responding. In the Budget Act of 2015, when the state and the UC worked together, they did find dedicated funding specifically for growth of California undergraduates, not nearly at the amount that the university had hoped. We nonetheless embarked on several years of growth, starting in the academic year 16-17. All 9 undergraduate campuses grew enrollment, and notably in the first big chunk of that enrollment growth, the enrollment at the university grew the most at Berkeley, Los Angeles, Riverside, and San Diego campuses. And then there's been substantial growth at the other 5 campuses as well. What it means is UC has added more than 17,400 California undergraduates since 2015 when that deal was made. So we have more good news. This year, the university admitted its most diverse class ever. The admitted class of California freshmen is at an all-time high. It's 80,000 students, but for the first time, Chicano Latino students are the largest racial ethnic group among admitted California freshmen, about 36%. That's about the same as Asian students, who comprised about 35% of the offers, and white students at about 21% of the offers. Clearly, there needs to be progress made with African American students. African American population in the state, I believe, is around 6%, and that isn't always the same as the college age-going population, but offers to African Americans were at about 5%. So UC admitted the largest class of California community college transfers in the history of the university. It was over 28,000. And we expect to increase our total enrollment by at least 1,600. Again, that's on top of those that we've enrolled over the past 5 years. So that's one thing. They want the access, and secondly, they want it to be affordable. Also understandable. The truth is that the university, after the Great Recession, was severely cut, along with all other state agencies. We weren't special in that regard. In response, the university raised tuition, basically doubled it over the course of a few years. Pre-Great Recession in 2007, tuition for California residents was about $6,000. In 2011, it was over $11,000. But then it stayed flat for about 6 years. Meanwhile, state general fund support was about $3.2 billion in 2007, but it was cut by almost $1 billion to $2.2 billion in 2011. So the tuition increase was shocking and challenging, particularly for families who did not qualify for state aid and who did not have costs fully or even partially covered by some other form of financial aid. For the university, the cuts were devastating and followed by years of no growth in tuition revenues from increases in tuition. So that was really, that sticks in the mind of state legislators still and to their constituents still to this day. But as I mentioned, the university did hold tuition flat for many years thereafter and went through a painful period of cuts, while at the same time worked really, really hard to increase and improve our graduation rates so that students were not stalling out, slowing down, and not graduating in a timely fashion. So I do have a success story on this front about affordability, where the state and UC have partnered, and it's to the enormous benefit of our students. UC and the state do have this extraordinary commitment to affordability for UC students. It's this shared commitment. It distinguishes both California and UC from other states, from other universities. You know, in other states, you have seen a very robust grant program and financial aid, or they have the institution itself, the university itself, with a very robust aid program. It's quite rare to see both. And here in California, we do both. It's reflective of our values that if students are capable and eligible for attending public higher education institutions, we want them. We are very much a knowledge-based economy here in California. We believe in equity of opportunity for students, and we need all of our students, not just the ones that can afford it. So through this collaboration, the university has a full 57% of its undergraduate students whose mandatory tuition and fees are fully covered. That really is a wonderful success story. But as we know, the barrier for many to attend college is not the cost of tuition alone. In fact, the bulk of the cost are in other total cost of attendance factors like this basic needs category of housing and dining, other necessities like books or technology, and of course, transportation and modest living expenses. UC's financial aid program accounts for that. So where the state's Cal Grant fully will cover tuition for many students, the university steps in with its own financial aid to pick up that tuition, and in many cases, far beyond the amount of tuition for students on a need base. So thirdly, I just want to say that the state is looking for us to excel in the areas that we as a public research university with the largest health professions educations programs in the country do in regular course. This has been underscored by the pandemic, by the wildfire crisis. They're really looking for us to continue to show leadership in this area, something that they're not necessarily as aware of all of the time, but it certainly is something that's pushed to the forefront right now. So in conclusion for this, I just wanted to endeavor to educate us on some of the basics and some of the dynamics, how the election has impacted us, and really understand what the state is expecting. I'm going to try and move on to the next screen here. Bear with me for a moment. I think we are surveying the future political landscape. So quickly, I just want to run through a few things in surveying the future landscape. We're going to look at some challenges and opportunities, and we're going to start with a relatively provocative question. Is California in crisis? Is the university in crisis? We're going to invoke a little bit of UC's research mission here and see if it can provide us some inspiration as we try and define the problems and discover solutions. So as I mentioned, there is this kind of provocative question, and is California in crisis? First, the obvious, coronavirus in California, it's rough. Secondly, issues of equity and opportunity and justice for all. And third, I would say how to meet the resource challenges posed not only by the pandemic, but climate change and an aging infrastructure, housing, and other cost of living factors. These are the challenges for the state, and I'm going to discuss a little bit how we might be able to work on some solutions. The coronavirus pandemic has hit California hard. So over 18,000 of our fellow Californians have succumbed. It truly is a very pernicious virus. The state indicates that over 100,000 persons have tested positive, with about 3,000 requiring hospitalization, almost 1/3 of those in intensive care. Less than a week ago, I saw a presentation from Dr. George Rutherford at UCSF, and he noted a few things. So again, I'm not a doctor, and a lot can change in a week, but at that time, it struck me from some data that he showed that the number of cases in the prior 7 days were increasing in areas where I would think. Those are the larger counties like LA and Sacramento and Orange and Riverside and Fresno. But what was really shocking was that the per capita cases were increasing in more rural and smaller population counties: Alpine, Mono County, Modoc County, Trinity County. So this is going to be a big challenge for California moving forward. What is the opportunity with that? Well, we all get to participate in slowing the transmission. I'm going to invoke here Dr. Carrie Byington, who's the Executive Vice President of UC Health. She also was presenting to a group of legislators recently, and she talked about the 3 W's and the 3 C's. Slowing transmission, so wear a mask, watch your distance, and wash your hands. Those are the 3 W's. Wear a mask, watch your distance, wash your hands. And also, avoid super spreading events. And those are the 3 C's: closed spaces, crowds, and close contact. So if we can do the 3 W's and the 3 C's, unfortunately, we don't have much else going for us now beyond what those experts are doing in clinical research, in basic sciences research that is going to lead to a vaccine. It's important to note that UC across the system is participating in multiple trials, including in the vaccine trials, Moderna and Pfizer. So we can also put the coronavirus into perspective a little bit. If you look across the country, there are states that have much smaller populations, like New York and Texas, that exceed California in deaths. So Dr. Rutherford showed a map. It's compiled by the New York Times based on data from county health departments all over the US. The greatest increase in cases were indicated with this dark red color. That meant 50 new cases per 100,000. The lightest yellow color indicated about 8 to 12 per 100,000. On the map, Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, and almost all of Minnesota were covered in very dark red. The Southeast and the Eastern Seaboard were more in the medium or the gold range, and California and a few Western states were comparatively on the low end of the scale. They're barely yellow. Of course, that was a week ago, and as we know, transmission rates were rising. We have talked a little bit about the impact to California's revenues from the coronavirus because of personal income tax and how that has resulted in less revenue for the state. But perhaps because of success with reopening the economy and public health measures to slow the transmission, we are, as a state, ahead of revenue projections for the current year, for 2021. So that's a bit of good news. And that leads me to my second point here, a point of equity and opportunity and justice for Californians. The pandemic has hit communities radically differently. Persons who are lower income, this includes those that work in service sectors, are being particularly hard hit. And so too are health outcomes worse for those with lower incomes. What we are seeing is a deepening of the wage gap, a bigger divide, a bigger wealth gap in a state that already had a significant wealth gap. So that's very problematic and something that is challenging the university and rather challenging the state. Certainly if we're shift to talk about how COVID is impacting the university, it has presented challenges that we've just never confronted before. Our faculty had to transform the way they teach practically overnight. I think our students are doing their best to stay on track, but it's tough, and our campuses are adapting as best they can. All campuses are providing remote instruction for the majority of classes with very limited exception, and all also offer remote counseling services such as telehealth counseling services, which were expanded during election week, I'll note. But I'm very proud of the UC community. I think we've quickly adopted in ways to learn and connect virtually. Some of the solutions that we're coming up with, you know, the local guidance varies in the individual jurisdictions where campuses are located. And because local facilities and student needs vary a lot, UC is allowing each campus to determine its own best approach. And I think that's actually a really great idea. For example, with the upcoming Thanksgiving break, which is scheduled in late November, several campuses, including Berkeley and San Diego, have decided students who are leaving the campus for Thanksgiving should stay home for the remainder of the semester and work remotely and live off campus to help stop the spread of COVID-19. Our campuses have done a really good job of tracking their own communities. They have COVID-19 dashboards on their web pages. They're typically updated daily. They provide a very clear and easy to read data on the number of tests that students and personnel have conducted and the number of positive rates and the positivity rate. Right now, the number of active cases across UC is quite low. At UCLA, for example, this was as of November 8th. The number of active cases included 5 staff and 8 students. So all of these individuals are getting the help they need and following appropriate protocols. UC Davis, our own UC Davis, conducted over 3,000 tests in the past 7 days prior to the 8th and had 3 campus individuals that tested positive for COVID and had only 6 positive tests among staff and students in the past 30 days. So that shows that they're doing quite a good job. Another thing, the university does a survey called UQs. So that's the University of California Undergraduate Experience Survey. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we've engaged a survey in addition to the regular UQs to hear the perspectives on the effects of the pandemic from students, how it's impacting their experience. What we've heard is that some students are facing grave challenges in the area of mental health and remote learning. For example, 35% of all undergraduates were very concerned with having access to an appropriate study space, but the figure was 45% for first-generation students. So there's some difference there. So in a way, I think it is an open question. Whether or not the university is in crisis, I don't think so. Whether or not the state will be and the university will be relies on a lot of factors that are beyond both of our control. But I also think that we're very capable to partner together for the benefit of the public good. And in that sense, I think the challenges are pretty clear. So moving on to the next slide here. Let's see if I can get it done. Yes, excellent. Now we're going to look finally at the political path to success. We're going to continue our journey here, traversing the political landscape and now chart a way forward. We've summoned, at least by analogy, our instruction and research mission. Now we're going to touch on our public service mission. So in this abstract for this talk, I promised to provide insight on how can UC navigate the coronavirus pandemic and continue to meet California's needs. At the same time, maintain our leadership in education, research, and public service. We're going to have to do all of this in spite of some of the political chaos that people pretend if it isn't actually going on at the national level and how that impacts the state, as well as just increasing demands from elected officials and their constituents here within the state. So again, this is admittedly daunting, but I do think that if we look to align strategically with the state and with the public, that is how we ultimately are going to get the support, financial and otherwise, that we need. I also think that we have to acknowledge that we can't do it all. We need each, the state and ourselves, to excel, but stay within our respective roles. So I'm going to describe a bit more why the landscape is rocky, but calling upon the best nature of UC and our public service mission, I will say there is a lot of common ground in how UC can help the state. So I'm going to digress just a little bit to say that for as long as Californians can remember, dating back to our Constitutional Convention in Monterey in 1849, the university and elected officials have been intertwined. 30 years later, at the second Constitutional Convention held right here in Sacramento, the state's representatives had a choice when it came to the university. There were already these criticisms. Some of them we're still familiar with now, that were coming from working folks and from farmers. There were those that felt the state legislature should have direct authority over the university. Others that thought the regents should be elected. But where they landed instead is with a governance structure for UC that really demonstrates trust and faith in the university. Similar to, in my view, the trust and faith that voters showed with the stem cell initiative. So I'm just going to read it because it's often mistaken. This is from Article 9, Section 9 of the Constitution, verbatim. The University of California shall constitute a public trust to be administered by the existing corporation known as the Regents of the University of California, with full powers of organization and government, subject only to such legislative control as may be necessary to ensure the security of its funds. Now, our Constitution, like any good Constitution, should be a living document, and it was further amended by the voters in 1976, and they added this: the university shall be entirely independent of all political or sectarian influence and kept free therefrom in the appointment of its regents and in the administration of its affairs, and no person shall be debarred admission to any department of the university on account of race, religion, ethnic heritage, or sex. So these provisions combined are what we think of in Sacramento as the university's autonomy. It's a source of friction between the university and the state, truly. But I would argue that it took an enormous amount of vision on the part of state leaders to grant that latitude to UC, and that it still demonstrates trust in the university. As I mentioned before, the legislature did have the opportunity to qualify a constitutional amendment for the ballot. It would not have reversed the university's autonomy, but in our view, it would have been a foot in the door or a bad precedent, or something that really could have led to some type of interference in the university's historic ability to determine curriculum, to determine admissions, in our historic ability to determine research. These are the things that we must stand by and we hold as our most sacrosanct values. So in the big picture, I do think that this autonomy not only affords privilege, but it also demands our responsibility. We have to try and meet the legislature and the state as much as possible where they are, so that we can move up or down together instead of missing each other. In practical terms, the state is limited in the way it can legislate over UC. The Constitution actually spells it out. It's things like purchasing of materials and goods and services, but it means they cannot directly legislate over admissions, tuition, research decisions, etc. We have autonomy in that regard. It also means that the state has no legal obligation to legislate appropriations to support UC. They do not have to give the university general support money. In fact, the legislature influences UC's operations through the funding that they do appropriate to us. So we, the state legislature and the university, need to find enough common ground so that we together are delivering the visions California have had for us dating back to Monterey and in Sacramento, so that we can have the freedom we need to produce for our state in the ways we do best. So I've got a few suggestions on how we can figure this out and try and get together. I will say this, however, in trying to address their priorities and move together with them to get them to address our priorities, we're going to get lost if we don't have our compass. And our compass is going to be our mission and our collective values. And one of those collective values is maintaining excellence. Access, affordability, but also excellence. There's a sweet spot we can get to with the state to maintain the level of excellence in our instruction and research and still provide support that our students so richly deserve and the excellent instruction and research that the university does together with our students. So starting with this issue of continuing to provide and expand access, one of the very highest priorities in the state. Some campuses, however, are physically bursting at their seams. Capital infrastructure and deferred maintenance continues to be an intractable issue. So what we can do moving forward is to try and address this demand for enrollment growth when state funds are made available to pay for it, by creative partnerships. One example would be partnerships that some campuses are exploring with reputable, even venerable private colleges that are located near UC campuses. Some of them are facing declining enrollments even before the pandemic and a loss of private funds. In other words, we could potentially solve our capacity issues at some of UC's oldest and most popular campuses by combining and collaborating with private colleges who are having enrollment issues. And we could leverage real estate, facilities, maybe even human infrastructure, and allow for additional undergraduate access to a UC degree. There might also be opportunities to leverage facilities from the other segments. I'm speaking here of shared facilities among the community colleges, CSU, and the university. Another element of access that we could perhaps achieve is through a rethinking of how we offer certain courses, including remote instruction, but I am quick to say that is not a panacea when it comes to cost. We are not producing widgets here, and we know that it is expensive to deliver instruction remotely in a way that is truly beneficial for our students. I think with the workforce demands and the degree shortage that California is facing, a demand for highly educated persons, a demand for health professionals, a demand for people with graduate degrees and doctoral degrees, that you can't manage to provide that on the cheap by shifting things over to remote instruction. So we do need to figure out a way how we can perhaps increase access. Maybe we could explore some creative solutions that involve UC extension and some of the other things that I've mentioned. Another area where I think we really have a good shot is aligning with the state again around addressing our capital needs. The state really did us a solid in the legislature by qualifying a bond for the ballot earlier this year. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, that facilities bond did not pass. So I mentioned the legislature, but the governor was also supportive and instrumental, and in fact, unlike a constitutional amendment qualifying, the governor's signature is needed for qualifying a general obligation bond, and he was very supportive and helpful in qualifying that. So it might not be a general obligation bond. Timing really factors into those sorts of things, but there are other ways that the state can work with us on some of our capital needs, and that in fact does impact our capacity. I also think that this is going to be a little bit more controversial. We need to help the state identify ways to allow UC to have the revenues that it needs, and also address this access issue, helping us to maintain our quest for more diversity and be a truly engine of social mobility. You know, one of the things we want to do is build a pipeline all the way from admissions to the professoriate, for a more diverse student and teacher, which in turn will help us to recruit students who someday will feel more welcome, more inspired to come to UC and perhaps achieve a doctoral degree and go out and become a teacher. So one way to do that is through a more stable revenue source. Starting with sort of an easy one would be a tuition policy. I'm certainly not the first to propose something that could appeal more to legislators, and that is some form of cohort tuition, or what we call cohort tuition. Of course, the idea behind that is you as a student enter as a first-year freshman or a first-year transfer, and you are guaranteed that your tuition and fees, that mandatory cost, would not increase during the time that you're working towards achieving your degree. There would, however, be an automatic tuition increase for the class that comes in behind you, limited to a certain moderate, predictable amount. And what it does is it allows students and families to know what it's going to cost them to get through in 2 years, to get through in 4 years, after they transfer, after they get admitted. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer than that, although we've made great strides in that area. So it would be more like a 3 or a 4 year and a 5 or a 6 year, something along those lines, where there could be that kind of guarantee. There are problems with it. There are many issues that need to be resolved. We've got leaders who are very smart, who are very experienced in this area, and I think some form of tuition policy. The reason why I raised that one is that could have the most appeal to legislators. You're not really raising tuition on any students who are currently enrolled. That's a big plus. When you're telling somebody, if your kid gets into UC, if your student, child gets into UC, this is what you are going to be required to contribute. There's a couple other that are a little bit more controversial. And one that's probably considered the most durable would be a constitutional amendment. I have a friend who refers to this as the "if you can't beat them, join them" method. K through 12 and community colleges have constitutionally mandated minimum expenditure through the state constitution. The university has looked before at things like a dedicated oil and gas extraction fee. Many other states have them to fund public higher education. Alaska, I believe Texas, many others do. So that is something that's been considered before in the past, and that could be something as part of a constitutional amendment that would be a little bit different than the other kind of ballot box budgeting where you're just going for an amount of general fund. Now, my friends who explore policy in these areas are probably saying, no more of that. But I do think conversation starters around this, if they feel the heat, they might see the light a little bit on something else. California has also done various tax schemes, usually focused on income tax and the highest income brackets. That is something that could be on the table. If that scares people, I know that's the idea to start the conversation. In any of these cases, we need outside help. The university is strictly prohibited from engaging in politicking itself. We are prohibited from using any university resources, including time, machinery, any university resources whatsoever in advancing ballot measures or candidate campaigns. So this is where our supporters, our alumni, others in their private life would need to rally around the university and help to chart a path forward in the political realm. So to my second point on the slide, I don't think we can betray who we are and what we are designed to do. The university is set up and reinforced through the master plan for higher education to be doing things differently than the CSU and then the community colleges. We need to stay in our wheelhouse. And I think we can do this in the short term, particularly in one area, and explore how to leverage sort of a midterm goal in another. And so that first area, I think, is health professions education. Some might be cynical and think, let no crisis go to waste. But the fact of the matter is, this is what we want to do. As the university, we want to help the state. The state is turning to us. The state has been very grateful. I've had so many legislators express to me recently how much they appreciate having the University of California available to them and their constituents. And I would say that in general, I do think that the legislature and the governor are doing their level best to support the university in the past couple years. And I think we've really started down a path that's quite positive with them. And I, for one, am very grateful and appreciative for that support and that help. We've got some new opportunity. More in the midterm, I think back to the success of the stem cell initiative, and I can't help but think that Californians are pro-science and that there might be something in there for our research mission. It may not be direct appropriation for our research mission, but I do believe that there is opportunity to sort of leverage maybe more state general fund support that is foundational to our research mission so that we can draw down the federal funds. We can have the best and brightest faculty and all they bring to the university for our students and our graduate students. still available to us moving forward, including a very diverse group of students and faculty. So those are just some of the ideas. Certainly during discussion, I'm happy to discuss any more. I'm going to jump up and say, what kind of state governmental relations person would I be if I didn't finish with a call to action? In this call to action, it's what you can do for UC. So my office is allowed to engage in policy advocacy and legislative advocacy, even though we can't advocate for ballot measures or for candidates. And one way that we do that is through the UC Advocacy Network. This is our digital network, but it's much broader than that. It's much more human than that. We now have a branch of UC Advocacy Network that are student ambassadors. We call them our UCAN student ambassadors. Highly engaged, even over Zoom. So I would just encourage anyone and everyone that's still listening out there, if you are, family members, if no one else, staff, if no one else, to please join UCAN. You can either text 52886 UC, text UC to 52886, or do it the way that I do it and just Google UC Advocacy Network, and it'll tell you everything you need to know by one click. So that'll help you to get involved and see what you can do to support the university. I hope this has been somewhat insightful or helpful to people to try and better understand where we are. I would close by saying this. In trying to accommodate both what the state would like to see from the university and the common ground that we have for them, and maintaining our excellence, which I do believe at the core, state policymakers really do want to see, but sometimes, we don't always come together. It's important for me personally for one reason at least. 20 years ago, when I first applied for this job, working in San Francisco at City Hall, I could have taken a lot of different paths. And ever since that first day that I started working at the university, I've been rewarded for work, for hard work and for trying to behave ethically and for trying to advance the mission, trying to do what's right. And I really appreciate an employer who values that in me. And I was an out gay man the entire time that I did all of it. And there was nobody that tried to make me, granted, I was in San Francisco at UCSF, but there was nobody that tried to make me feel uncomfortable or less than. That is probably not at all the experience that many people have with the university or other large institutions. I know that. But that is what we aspire to. That is what we are working for. That is what I vow to work for people on my staff and my team that I work with. It's very important. This is something that is critical to the university's success, and it's something that the state really wants us to pursue. The governor, the legislature really wants us to pursue this. So I do think there's a bit of a wheelhouse there for both us and the state. I could have stayed at City Hall and been very welcome and had a good career there as well. I'd like to think that the university's getting their money's worth out of me and that they're getting their work worth out of me. And so this is one of the reasons why I think it's just imperative that we have to really try to work together to move the university forward, which is moving the state forward, to move the state forward, which will move the university forward. So with that, that's probably too much. But pleased to have had this opportunity and very, very grateful. Fiat Lux.
Kieran, thank you so much. Thank you for your personal contribution. Thank you for this wonderful, capacious presentation. We've learned so much. So I'm going to be moderating the question period. I have some on mind, but I'm asking everyone who's out there in Radio Land to use the Q&A function and write in your question. I'm also seeing comments come in on the chat, but let me start with a question. You can ask to be anonymous, but this one is not anonymous. It's from Rich Kravitz, who, as you know, is the director of the UC Center in Sacramento, and I'll just give a plug for everyone to know that UC Davis runs the UC Center in Sacramento for the whole system. But Dr. Kravitz asks, is it true that states focuses on access and affordability for undergraduates, and does the corollary of that other contributions, graduate education, health education, research? We'd love to hear what the perception is of those extraordinary contributions and missions of the university.
Thank you very much, Ralph, for that question. And I think I caught it, even though you cut out for a little bit there. And thank you, Dr. Kravitz, when you said, Dr. Kravitz, who you know is, and I almost piped in and said, excellent, because he's doing such a great job with the UC Center Sacramento. So thank you, Rich, for sending the question. Unfortunately, I would say we have a lot of work to do in getting a level of support and appreciation. I mean, I'll just be frank with you. You asked basically, because of the focus on access and affordability at the undergraduate level, do other aspects of what the university uniquely does suffer? And I think I would have to say yes. We have an opportunity for the state to bring along more funding again for graduate students, and in the form of enrollment growth for graduate students. I do think we have the opportunity to bring the state along into health professions education. I think that's something that we can certainly, and I talked a little bit about that, but unfortunately what we saw when things got rough after the Great Recession was a prioritization on California undergraduates, as opposed to the other aspects of our instructional and certainly the way that intertwines with our research mission. So we have seen in the past few years some ongoing support for graduate instruction, graduate enrollment growth, but it wasn't nearly as much as we had hoped for. I will say though, every time I say something like that, I think back to certain legislative staff who just basically had to crawl over ground glass with me to really get it done and push it over the line. So I don't in any way want anybody to think that there's a lack of understanding or trying on the part of some really well-positioned, hardworking, good advocates for the university, many of whom are longtime staff, many, of course, of whom are legislators themselves. So don't misinterpret, but to be frank and honest, yeah, graduate and doctoral suffers when there's this almost myopic focus on undergraduate access.
So I wonder if I could offer a follow-up that I think is connected to this. And I'm thinking of the excellence of the university, and certainly from my perspective, I think from the world's perspective, it and has an international mission. I know you're terrified now. And so many of our graduates, of course,
you cut out, Ralph. So I didn't.
You're not hearing me well?
Yeah, you cut out right before the part where you said I was terrified.
Well, the question is how you can help our legislative supporters and critics understand the importance of our international profile, both in research and also graduate students, many of whom are international. Many of our faculty are international. And in the term of universities at our level, we play at an international arena. So how do you translate that to the state legislature of one state, none of whose constituents are outside of California?
Yeah, so one of the ways that we try and do that is we try and explain to them by being international university in the sense of contributing to our local community, contributing to the state, contributing to the nation, and really advancing health worldwide, or any number of things that we're doing for the betterment of society writ large. One of the things that we try and do is say that there's a symbiotic relationship where students who come here from elsewhere oftentimes remain here. They keep their ideas, they start their businesses, they have their discoveries, they make California a better place. California has always been at the forefront. You'll see, I don't know, jurisprudence or some other area where you'll see courts lead the way on something that sweeps the nation. I kind of feel it's the same way, where you'll have researchers in the form of graduate students, or somebody who comes here as a performing artist from another place in a graduate program, who becomes a star and contributes to California's cultural and social vitality, or a researcher who meets a workforce need that we have here in California. We're trying to leverage data as best we can in that regard. It's a little bit hard because we can't force people to allow us to track them after they graduate, after they achieve their degree and whatnot. But we've gotten a lot better at that. And I think we got to just keep coming back to, it's what's in it for them, meaning what's in it for their state, their constituents, what they represent.
Thank you. A question of a totally different nature. Christina Green asks, will students be able to connect with you through LinkedIn or email?
So, Christina, I would encourage you to, if you're interested in following up, I would encourage you to contact my office, which is the State Governmental Relations Office. You can find that at the ucop.edu website, ucop.edu, ucop.edu, and just search for State Governmental Relations, and it'll give you some contact information. And if there's anything you'd like to discuss now, I'm happy to.
And she's thanking you.
Great.
So Jonathan Howard asks, you mentioned the red versus green dynamic at the Capitol. Is there anything you could say about the dynamic within the Democrats, between the moderate and progressive Democrats, and how that affects UC and their efforts in Sacramento?
Very good. So thank you, Jonathan. So, it's kind of a question mark. I think when you look at what happened in the state legislature in the Senate flipped seats that were Republican to Democratic seats, primarily in Orange County, or in areas that were more traditionally conservative, and now are quite blue. But I would say it's a different kind of blue. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's light blue, but there's going to have to be, I would think, in order for them to appropriately represent their constituency, a bit more of a moderate stance on things. And I do think that across the board, be they ultra liberal to ultra conservative, that we do have our champions in the legislature. We need to cultivate them. I think, Jonathan, I'm glad you asked. I think, Jonathan, what we're going to try and focus on is we're going to try and focus on the legislature that is going to be coming in, like in the assembly, because of a change in term limits that the voters brought, I believe, in 2010, Prop 25 maybe. What we see is that legislators are more commonly staying in one house. They can serve all 12 years in the assembly or all 12 years in the Senate, instead of being capped at 6 in the assembly, then trying to run for the Senate seat, for instance. And so I think what the university needs to really do is we need to cultivate champions as early as possible when legislators get into the legislature. And we're going to see a whole new class coming in 2024. Of course, we're not going to wait 4 full years. We're cultivating new members that are coming in all along. And that's going to be important, because identifying a champion along those lines, it won't matter how liberal or how conservative. We're going to be able to, there's something at the university, they definitely admire the competitive spirit that is at the core of public research institutions. So this is actually something that was quite misunderstood by a lot of legislators, and many of them really understand it now and they like it. The fact that peer-reviewed research at the federal level, and that we have professors that are competing for it, and that they're bringing it here instead of the University of North Carolina or MIT or wherever it might be, is a big plus. And they're starting to know and understand that in a big way. And it's, in their mind, it makes us more efficient. It makes us a little bit, when we're very competitive like that, you got to be good. You got to be on it. You got to be working hard to draw down that federal funding. And that appeals to a lot of the more conservatives. I will say the more conservative spectrum also agreed wholeheartedly with bonds, with infrastructure funding for the university. And that's super important. So we've got friends everywhere. We're fortunate in that regard.
Yeah, and since you mentioned new people coming to the assembly, I will give a shout out to Davis alum Alex Lee, who I think becomes the youngest member of the assembly. And if I remember correctly,
by a long shot, I think.
Yeah, and I can tell you he's a tough questioner, because I was chancellor when he was asking those questions. So good for us.
Excellent.
That he'll be there. I want to combine a question I had with one that an anonymous attendee posed, and it has to do about how UC can help California K through 12 schools better prepare all of the students for being competitive for UC. And the part I wanted to add into that, and I will bring into this a presentation from a number of years ago in these forums by UCLA's Patricia Gondara, who studies inequity in public education. And I can recommend to all, you should all know that all of our previous forums are available online at the forum's site, but her talk helped sear in my mind facts about the inequality between the preparation that students get in our California public schools, and how that disproportionately disadvantages African Americans, Native Americans, and Latino students. And that is a product in large part to the funding scheme the state has for K through 12. So I guess I come to my question, and you can translate it for the legislators you talk to. They want us, as you said, to have in our student body a representative picture of the population of California. And yet the funding of K through 12 makes that so difficult. And I wonder how you bring that all together and what California can do to try to equalize that very unequal pathway to UC or CSU.
So it's a really good question, and I'm not sure that I've got a good answer. I am hopeful, and I think that we're seeing the beginnings of what the state and Governor Brown led and instituted in a local control funding formula that intends to try and address some of the resource inequality that exists at the K through 12 level. So I sort of credit the state for trying to address that. It's not easy. There's always whether it's true or not, there's always at least a perception among the public that there's going to be winners and losers. Sometimes you can't convince people that you're lifting all boats, and if you're lifting one boat a lot and the other one just a little, that boat might feel like they're sinking nonetheless. So I do credit the state for really having tried hard, and I think it could be working. I don't know, but I think it could be working well. The other thing that I would say is, I think the pandemic has really pointed out where inequities lie among technology and resources. And, one of the things, it's almost like the information age and technology age impacted by the pandemic is sort of like, in a lot of ways, like the Industrial Revolution or something, having such a profound impact on things, and then something like the labor movement coming into it and changing the way the Industrial Revolution looks, from being one that had as characteristics a huge wealth gap and squalor and inequality and danger and all of these sorts of things, and then the two kind of paired together so that industry and the Industrial Revolution could really advance the country. I kind of feel the way about the technology age, and what we see in the problems of the digital divide, and in a pandemic comes in. If the pandemic that requires K through 12 and others to have resources that allow for better remote instruction and more access to remote instruction, there may be a path or an avenue for the university, be it through a UC Scout type of program or some other type of program, where there's an infrastructure that should be, hopefully, being filled out a little bit more at the K through 12, that we might be able to sort of capitalize on. And what we've learned about remote instruction and shifting quickly over to it, maybe there's a way that we could seize the moment there. So big ideas that need to be figured out by people far smarter than me, or at least more versed in them specifically. But those are some thoughts that I think maybe Sacramento would love to see. They certainly love our programs that help train teachers in K through 12. They certainly help our college counselors that are embedded in K through 12 schools. They certainly love everything that we do in academic preparation by way of programs like MESA and Puente. So I think there's an opportunity there with the legislature on this issue of equity among K through 12 and college prep.
I to submit a question or two. Meanwhile, I'm thinking, just today we heard you mentioned affirmative action, and that the measure that would have repealed 209 or reversed it did not pass. It's interesting, in a court case that we heard from today, an appeals court did not find that Harvard discriminated, yet that probably teased that case up for the Supreme Court. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about where this is going to go. And this is sort of more than California. This is more nationally. It's a very, very sensitive issue, and people fall on different sides of it.
Yeah, I think it's a really tough one. And I think that amending the California Constitution, so this is the curse, I think, of, if you think back to, not that any of us were alive, but in 1911, when they came forward with this initiative process, this direct democracy in California, Governor Hiram Johnson, and it was, at the time envisioned as a way of reining in corporate interests that had just run amok, railroads and other big corporate interests that were just, and they needed to return power back to the populace, and they did it through this direct democracy. Now, you can pay people to collect signatures and qualify something for the ballot. There are other ways of influencing how people are going to vote by funding the campaign once it does qualify for the ballot. It's almost like anybody with the money it's perverse. It's come full circle, where now the problem is that the money is negatively impacting our initiative process there. So that's all kind of a long way of saying the initiative process for something like this is going to be fraught with problems, because it's already in our Constitution. Repealing it from the Constitution after it's just lost by about 13 percentage points, it's going to take time and a different kind of effort and feeling. I do think it does one thing, though. It clarifies that, especially when we look at all of the energy around, I went to undergraduate at the University of Minnesota, and it was heartbreaking to see Minneapolis, a city that I love and that had always considered to be progressive and a caring place, to be the poster child for systemic racism through authority of public people, those that are supposed to protect the public, in the instance of George Floyd in the Minneapolis Police Department. And so I think there's just such a heightened awareness now that there's got to be some sort of energy that we can at least capitalize to try and bring about a more just and equitable society within our society that is the University of California, because that society impacts all the others. We send ourselves out there into the world and make it a better place. And so certainly the admissions process that we have at the university, with comprehensive reviews and a more holistic look at admissions, is something that we're always looking to enhance and improve upon. But there's probably going to need to be more. I think President Drake is very committed to being a leader in this area. Not that he doesn't have enough to do, but it's that important for all of us that hopefully. So that's a bit of a non-answer, but I'm getting at, I don't think we're going to do it at the ballot box here. So we're going to have to come up with something better.
Okay, well, we don't have any outstanding questions, so my role is to thank you on behalf of us all for a wonderful presentation, and also all that you continue to do for the UC. It's clear that we are well represented in Sacramento, and thank you. And
well,
you're out there on the ice for us.
Well, I'm very flattered and very appreciative. And for anybody that's listening, please do join the UC Advocacy Network, and we can all help the university, help the state, and move forward from here. So thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone. And until the next forum, carry on and best wishes. Thank you.